In 1895, the British East India Company invaded and colonized Kenya. When the company fell at the beginning of the 20th century, the British government took over and colonized land and labor. The British took land away from Kenyans and introduced forced labor. 50 years later, when some Kenyans began to revolt, the British began a brutal military campaign that included detention camps and torture. When the British began settling in Kenya, they enacted a series of oppressive taxes to ensure they generate revenue. The hut tax, a tax paid to the British government for each family-owned hut, was introduced in 1902. This meant that Kenyans had to work for someone else in order to have money to pay for the tax. If they didn't pay, the punishment was forced labor. It was followed by the poll tax. Kenyans had to work 60 days a year for the government if they were not already employed by British settlers. By 1913, British settlers were given 999-year leases on stolen land and they needed labor for them. The Kenyans who lived on the land stolen by the British were deemed squatters and made up most of the agricultural labor on farms. Over the years, their tenancy rights were eliminated, and by 1939, settlers could demand 270 days of work from the squatters. These settlers even created identity discs for Kenyans to limit the movement of laborers. Many Kenyan workers were poorly treated by settlers, and flogging was commonly used to discipline them. After years of marginalization, injustice, and inequalities perpetuated by the British, a resistant movement called the Maumau was born in 1950. It was comprised of ethnic groups such as the Kikuyu, Kenya's largest native tribe. They advocated for resistance and revolts against British domination, even if it meant taking up arms. The Maumau was said to have taken a ritual oath to promote unity in the movement. Roughly 1.5 million Kikuyu supported the movement for their freedom. The British responded by saying the Maumau were savages and branded them as terrorists.
In Nairobi, capital of Kenya, Europeans and Africans still walk the streets in fear of the dreaded maumau.
The Maumau planned attacks targeting British farms and settlers as well as Kikuyu who were loyal to the British. In 1952, the British declared a state of emergency and began military operations against the Maumau. First, a forest war was waged against 20,000 Maumau fighters. By the end of the 8-year campaign, around 11,000 Maumau and 32 British settlers were killed. But some historians say the number of Maumau who lost their lives may be much higher. Then the British set up detention camps. Historians initially said 80,000 Kikuyu were detained, but recent studies suggest that the number may be as high as 160,000 to 320,000. The British branded them as rehabilitation camps that encouraged good citizenship and re-educated the Maumau away from their nationalist views. However, secret documents which were unearthed 50 years later in 2011 after 4 elderly Kenyans sued Britain's Foreign and Commonwealth Office tell a different story. The documents confirm the detainees were isolated, tortured, raped, forced to work, and sometimes murdered. Villages made up of Kikuyu women and children were also enclosed and heavily patrolled. This led to disease and starvation. Despite Britain's campaign, the Maumau movement spearheaded Kenya's independence movement. Jomo Kenyatta, a Maumau leader who had been imprisoned in 1953, eventually became the Prime Minister of an independent Kenya in 1963. In 2013, the British government finally reached an agreement with lawyers acting for the victims. The country finally acknowledged the torture and abuse that took place and promised to pay $31 million to the victims. 5,228 living victims received just under $4,650 each. Britain still does not accept that it is legally liable for its actions under the colonial administration.